Leona Harper, a young black woman on her way to a prestigious conference, had never stepped foot in the luxurious VIP lounge of an airport before. Clutching her tote bag, she felt out of place but determined to focus on her goals. Yet, what should have been a quiet moment of preparation turned into a nightmare when a flight attendant, Sarah Benson, accused her of stealing a ring that had gone missing. Without evidence, security was called, and Leona found herself at the center of a humiliating spectacle. But what Sarah didn't expect was that her assumption of guilt based solely on appearances would unravel before her eyes. As Leona stood firm in her innocence, the truth began to surface. Sarah's accusations weren't just baseless, they were part of a larger pattern of targeting people who didn't fit. What happened next would shock everyone involved, turning the tables in a way no one saw coming. This story isn't just about Leona, it's about challenging the prejudices ingrained in our society and refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. Stay with us to hear how one woman's courage exposed the truth and set off a chain of events that changed everything. Before we get started, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more impactful stories like this. The lounge was hushed, a curated quiet that hummed with the weight of affluence. A faint murmur of conversations drifted through the room, punctuated by the occasional clink of glass against glass. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the polished marble floors, mingling with the sharper notes of fresh espresso. Leona Harper sat alone near a wide window, her canvas tote nestled tightly against her lap. Outside, the late afternoon sun threw streaks of gold across the tarmac, where sleek private jets shimmered like pearls. Leona adjusted her posture, her spine straight but her shoulders hunched inward. She wasn't sure if the room felt foreign to her, or if she felt foreign to it. Her denim jacket and comfortable sneakers might as well have been an announcement. You don't belong here. Around her, travelers in designer suits and delicate silk scarves moved with the ease of belonging, their laughter warm and intimate. Across the lounge, a woman in a sharp navy uniform stood near the refreshments table, scanning the room with deliberate precision. Sarah Benson, her blonde hair was neatly coiled, her posture upright and commanding. She was efficient, polished, and utterly in control except for the subtle tightening of her jaw as her eyes landed on Leona. Leona felt the gaze before she saw it. She glanced up, catching Sarah's expression for the briefest moment, something cold, calculating, and slightly curious. Sarah's lips pressed together into a polite but distant line before she turned away. Leona exhaled softly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. This wasn't the first time Leona had felt like a stranger in a room full of strangers. But today, the sensation clung to her more than usual, like a damp chill that seeped into her bones. She was here because of her scholarship, her paper on systemic inequality earning her a coveted invitation to a conference in New York. The ticket had been handed to her as a symbol of recognition, validation. But now, sitting amidst polished wealth, it felt like a heavy chain. She tried to focus on her notebook, flipping open the pages filled with notes and ideas for her presentation. But the words blurred. Instead, her ears caught fragments of nearby conversations. The market's been volatile, but it's nothing we can't weather. Oh, darling, did you see the photos from Milan? Her kind always acts so entitled. Leona's head snapped up at that last voice. Low but distinct, she couldn't tell where it had come from. A cluster of well-dressed women sat nearby, their laughter light but cutting. She told herself it wasn't about her, but the words settled uncomfortably in her chest, a familiar ache she couldn't shake. Can I get you anything, ma'am? Leona looked up to see a server standing near her with a tray of sparkling drinks. His smile was professional but strained, his eyes flickering briefly to her bag before meeting hers. She hesitated before shaking her head. No, thank you. The server moved on, but Leona caught it just for a second, a glance exchanged between him and another employee. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it stung. Her chest tightened. They think you don't belong here. They think you'll cause trouble. Across the room, Sarah's eyes had returned to Leona, though this time they carried a sharper edge. Sarah adjusted the cuff of her uniform, her fingers brushing the delicate gold band with the ruby stone on her ring finger. She turned to a colleague, her voice a whisper but her posture tense. Keep an eye on her, Sarah said, her tone clipped. Something feels off. The colleague frowned but nodded. Leona, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, returned to her notebook, though her pen moved slowly now. The air in the lounge had shifted. It was no longer simply quiet, it was charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken judgments. Minutes later, Sarah's hand darted to her wrist, her breath catching. Her ring, her late mother's heirloom, was gone. She stiffened, her eyes scanning the room wildly. Her gaze landed once again on Leona. The tension that had been building in the lounge snapped taut, the silence now brimming with accusation. The first stirrings of alarm were faint. Sarah Benson's fingers brushed the empty space where the ring should have been. The absence like a sudden hollow in her chest. She froze for a moment, her breath shallow, as though stillness might conjure the missing heirloom back to its rightful place. But the sensation of loss only deepened, morphing into dread. Her pulse quickened. She retraced her steps in her mind. She had been near the refreshments table, then the counter at the lounge's far side. Her gaze swept the room, searching for the faint ruby glint she knew so well. But her eyes kept returning to Leona Harper, sitting quietly by the window, her head bent over a notebook. Sarah clenched her jaw. It wasn't just the absence of the ring, it was the way the young woman sat there, seemingly apart from everything, yet drawing attention in her own subdued way. The casualness of her attire, the way she hugged her bag protectively, it all felt deliberate to Sarah, like a quiet defiance that grated against the polished order of the space. She motioned to her colleague, a wiry man named David who had worked with her for years. His brow furrowed as she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ring," she said tightly. "It's gone. I think she might have taken it." David glanced at Leona, his expression skeptical but cautious. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Maybe you misplaced it." "I didn't misplace it," Sarah snapped, though her voice remained low. "It was on my hand. She was near my station earlier. I want you to get security quietly. We'll keep this contained." David hesitated, his eyes flicking between Sarah and Leona. "I don't know, Sarah," he murmured. "What if you're wrong?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we'll apologize later." "But I'm not wrong." David nodded reluctantly and slipped away toward the lounge exit. Across the room, Leona shifted in her seat, her pen still poised over the page. She felt it again, that subtle, invasive prickle at the back of her neck. She glanced up, her eyes scanning the lounge, and her gaze collided with Sarah's. For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze, charged with unspoken tension. Sarah looked away quickly, but Leona's stomach churned. She had been in places like this before. Not lounges, necessarily, but rooms where her presence was questioned not by words, but by glances, gestures, and the unrelenting weight of expectation. It wasn't always what people said. It was what they didn't have to say. Leona closed her notebook, her movements deliberate but calm, as though maintaining her composure could shield her from whatever storm was brewing. She reached for her bag, checking its contents more out of habit than necessity. She told herself to breathe, to stay steady, but the low hum of murmurs around her seemed to grow louder, sharper, until it was hard to ignore. By the time David returned with 2 uniformed security guards, the room had taken on a subtle but unmistakable charge. Conversations grew hushed, heads turned, and whispers rippled through the lounge like a rising tide. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the guards said as they approached Leona. His tone was neutral, but his presence was anything but. "We need to ask you a few questions." Leona blinked, her heart sinking as she looked up at them. "Questions? About what?" "Sarah Benson, one of our attendants, has reported a missing item," the guard said carefully. "A ring." Leona stiffened, her fingers tightening around her bag's strap. "I don't know anything about a ring," she said firmly. "I've been sitting here the whole time." The second guard exchanged a glance with Sarah, who stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We'd appreciate it if you could cooperate and let us check your bag," he said. The words struck Leona like a blow. She opened her mouth to protest, but the room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in as dozens of eyes bore into her. She looked around, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, but saw only curiosity, cold, detached, and disbelieving. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You have no right to search my things. I didn't take anything. It's just a precaution," Sarah interjected, her tone clipped but laced with a subtle edge of righteousness. "If you didn't take it, then you have nothing to worry about." Leona stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "I don't need to prove my innocence," she said, her voice louder now, carrying across the room. "If you lost your ring, that's on you, not me." The murmurs around them grew louder, the tension thick enough to cut. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment. But she didn't back down. "We're only trying to resolve this quickly," she said sharply. "You're trying to humiliate me," Leona shot back, her eyes blazing, "because I don't look like I belong here." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence broken only by the distant hum of engines outside. Then one of the guards cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't about appearances. It's just protocol." "No," Leona said again, her voice steel now. "This is about more than a ring. And you all know it." The lounge, so serene moments before, was now a battlefield of unspoken biases and unmasked tensions. Sarah's confidence faltered, but she held her ground. The guards hesitated, caught between procedure and the mounting unease in the room. Leona didn't flinch. She was scared, yes, but anger had taken root, steadying her. She wouldn't let them strip her of her dignity. Not here, not now. As the confrontation reached its boiling point, a boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, momentarily cutting through the chaos. But for Leona and Sarah, the storm was only beginning. The tension aboard the flight was palpable, though it lingered in the air like smoke, unspoken but stifling. Passengers adjusted their silk scarves and tailored jackets, pretending to focus on their devices or their champagne flutes. But their glances betrayed them. Leona Harper could feel every one of those stares. She sat stiffly in her window seat, staring out at the runway as the plane taxied, her bag now tucked tightly under the seat in front of her. The hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin, a background score to her quickened heartbeat. She clutched the armrests, not from fear of flying but from the sheer humiliation of the lounge confrontation that had followed her onto this plane like a shadow. Across the aisle, Sarah Benson moved with brisk efficiency, her heels clicking softly against the plush carpet as she double-checked overhead bins and smiled at passengers. But her professional demeanor was a thin veneer, and Leona could see the tension in her movements, the way her eyes flickered toward Leona, the way her jaw tightened when she passed by her seat. Leona had tried to block out the whispers that followed her from the lounge to the boarding gate, but they echoed still. Did you see the way she reacted? What was she doing in the VIP lounge anyway? It's always the ones who don't belong. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and preparing them for takeoff. But even as the plane ascended, the weight of the ground below seemed to cling to Leona. As the plane leveled out, Sarah approached Leona's row with deliberate steps. She paused at Leona's seat, her voice low but clipped. "Miss Harper, I need to speak with you." Leona's stomach clenched. She turned to look at Sarah, her expression calm but her eyes wary. "About what? I think you know," Sarah replied, her tone sharper now. Leona straightened in her seat, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of Sarah's gaze. "I've already told you I didn't take your ring." A man seated across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, clearly eavesdropping despite his pretense of reading the in-flight magazine. A woman seated behind Leona leaned slightly forward, her curiosity palpable. "I'm going to need to inspect your bag," Sarah said firmly. "No," Leona said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "You're not." Sarah's composure cracked, her professionalism slipping. "Miss Harper, this isn't a request. It's for everyone's peace of mind." The words hung in the air, and the passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The flight had gone from exclusive to excruciatingly tense, the divide between Leona and the others growing wider with every word Sarah spoke. Leona stood her ground. "You have no right to search my bag. If you think I did something wrong, call the police when we land. Until then, leave me alone." Sarah's face reddened, her frustration evident. She straightened and turned to a nearby flight attendant, gesturing for her to come over. Together, they whispered in hurried tones, casting glances toward Leona. Leona's heart pounded as she glanced around the cabin. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the silent judgments piling on top of one another. No one spoke up for her. No one asked why she was being singled out. Instead, they watched, detached, as though this scene was simply part of the in-flight entertainment. Sarah returned, her voice louder now, addressing both Leona and the other passengers. For everyone's safety and comfort. We'll handle this situation appropriately when we land. Leona's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the armrests. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? No matter what I say. You've decided I'm guilty. Sarah's lips thinned. This isn't personal. Yes, it is, Leona said, her voice rising now. It's personal because I don't fit the image of who you think belongs here. It's personal because you'd rather assume the worst about me than consider for 1 second that you're wrong. The cabin fell silent, the passengers stunned by the rawness of her words. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the pilot's voice broke over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please prepare for descent. The tension thickened as the plane began its gradual descent, the atmosphere heavy with the unresolved conflict. Leona kept her eyes fixed on the window, her reflection staring back at her, a reminder of the isolation she felt in a space designed to exclude. When the plane landed and the cabin door opened, the first face Leona saw was a uniformed officer standing at the gate. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore an expression of quiet authority. Brian Benson, Sarah's husband. Sarah's face lit up with vindication as she gestured toward Leona. That's her, she said, her voice filled with self-righteous triumph. Leona's breath hitched as Brian approached, his gaze cool and assessing. Miss Harper, he said evenly, please come with me. The murmurs started again, the passengers craning their necks to watch as Leona, shoulders stiff but head held high, followed Brian down the jet bridge. The whispers stung worse than any words spoken directly. She doesn't look innocent to me. I told you something was off about her. Always the same story. Leona kept walking, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and fury. She wasn't just walking toward an interrogation room, she was walking toward a battle she never chose but couldn't avoid. The fight wasn't just about a ring. It was about dignity, identity, and the unyielding weight of assumptions. And as the airport lights glared down on her, Leona knew this was far from over. The fluorescent lights of the airport's security office buzzed faintly, casting an unforgiving glare over the small, sterile room. Leona Harper sat at the cold metal table, her hands clasped tightly together, her fingers trembling despite her efforts to steady them. Across from her, Brian Benson loomed like a shadow, his uniform lending him an authority that felt both overwhelming and crushing. Leona kept her gaze fixed on the table, her mind racing through the events that had brought her here. The lounge, the whispers, the accusations, the flight. Each moment replayed itself, sharp and unrelenting, like shards of glass cutting deeper into her resolve. Miss Harper, Brian began, his voice calm but edged with a steely undertone. I want to give you the chance to explain yourself. She looked up then, meeting his eyes. They were cold, calculating, and searching not for truth, but for confirmation of what he already believed. I've told you everything, she said, her voice low but steady. I didn't take her ring. I don't even know what it looks like. Brian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You were in the lounge, near her station, and now the ring is missing. That's not a coincidence. It's also not proof. Leona shot back, the frustration slipping into her tone despite her best efforts. You're accusing me based on nothing but assumptions. Brian's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping into a sharper, more pointed register. Watch your tone, Miss Harper. This isn't about assumptions. It's about evidence. Leona felt her pulse quicken, anger bubbling beneath her skin. If it's about evidence, then where is it? If you had any, you wouldn't need to bring me here and try to intimidate me. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to smother. Brian's eyes narrowed, and Leona could see the shift in his posture, a man unused to being challenged, especially by someone like her. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Sarah stepped inside. Her presence was electric, her composure brittle but determined. She carried a small zippered pouch, which she placed on the table with deliberate care. I found this, Sarah announced, her voice tinged with triumph. She unzipped the pouch and produced a gold chain. It was under one of the seats in the lounge. And, she added, her eyes locking onto Leona, it matches the description of something that could have been connected to her bag. Leona stared at the chain, her mind reeling. The accusation was absurd, but the weight of it bore down on her like a physical force. That's not mine, she said firmly. Sarah smirked, her confidence swelling. Of course, it isn't. Brian cleared his throat, his gaze flickering between Sarah and Leona. "Miss Harper, this doesn't look good for you. If you cooperate, it'll be easier for everyone." Leona felt her composure cracking, the unfairness of the situation pressing against her chest like a vice. She thought of all the times she'd been scrutinized, questioned, and doubted for reasons that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with who she was. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the quiver in her hands. "I'm not cooperating with a setup." Sarah bristled, her facade of professionalism slipping. "A setup? You think this is some conspiracy against you?" "I don't think," Leona replied, her voice rising. "I know, you lost your ring, and instead of owning up to it, you're trying to pin it on the easiest target in the room." The room fell into a tense silence, the air crackling with unspoken truths. Brian shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but Sarah's face hardened. "You're out of line," Sarah said sharply, "and you're out of evidence." Leona shot back. The door opened again, and Evan Mitchell stepped in. The younger officer carried a tablet under his arm and wore an expression that was both serious and resolute. He glanced at Brian, then at Sarah, and finally at Leona, his gaze lingering for a moment. "What's going on here?" Evan asked, his tone neutral but probing. "We're questioning a suspect," Brian replied curtly. Evan raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to the chain on the table. "And what evidence do we have linking her to this?" Sarah opened her mouth, but Evan held up a hand. "Before you answer, I'd like to point out that I've been reviewing the lounge security footage." Brian stiffened, and Evan placed the tablet on the table and tapped the screen, pulling up a video, and it shows Sarah placing the ring into a drawer behind her station. The timestamps match the timeline before she reported it missing. The room froze. Sarah's face drained of color, her confident facade crumbling under the weight of Evan's words. "That's impossible," Sarah stammered. "The footage must be wrong." Evan's gaze hardened. "Footage doesn't lie, Sarah, but people do." Leona felt a surge of relief, tempered by the anger that still simmered within her. She looked at Sarah, her voice steady and clear. "You were so quick to accuse me because it was easier than admitting your own mistake." Brian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough. We'll review this properly." Evan nodded, but his eyes never left Sarah. "Yes, we will. And we'll make sure it's handled fairly." As the room emptied, Leona felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Though the scars of the ordeal remained fresh, she knew this wasn't over. The truth was out, but justice was still far away. For now, though, she had her voice and she intended to use it. The next morning dawned gray, the kind of muted light that seemed to carry the weight of unresolved tension. Leona Harper sat on a wooden bench outside the police station, the chill of the metal seeping through her thin jacket. The events of the night before played on a relentless loop in her mind. The accusations, the chain on the table, the footage, it all felt surreal, as though she were living someone else's nightmare. She stared at the scuffed tips of her sneakers, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A faint murmur of voices drifted from inside the station, a constant reminder that her battle was far from over. The confrontation in the interrogation room had shifted the narrative. Yes, but it hadn't ended it. Not when Sarah and Brian Benson still held the power to spin the truth. "Leona." She looked up to see Evan Mitchell standing in the doorway, his expression serious but not unkind. He motioned for her to follow him inside. The station was a hive of activity, officers moving with purpose while phones rang incessantly in the background. Evan led her to a small conference room, where he closed the door behind them. He gestured to the chair across from him and sat down, placing a slim file folder on the table between them. "I've reviewed more of the footage," he began, his tone measured, "and I've also been looking into Sarah Benson's record. There are patterns." Leona raised an eyebrow, her hands still folded tightly in her lap. "Patterns?" Evan opened the folder and slid a document toward her. "There have been similar incidents in the past, accusations of theft. Vague evidence, but the cases always get dropped before they go anywhere." Leona frowned, leaning forward to read the report. Her stomach tightened as she scanned the lines. How does she keep getting away with this? "Connections," Evan replied simply. "Her husband is well respected, and Sarah knows how to work the system. But this time, she underestimated the paper trail." Leona looked up, her eyes narrowing. "So what happens now? Do you think they'll actually face consequences?" Evan hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. That's the hard part. People like Sarah and Brian, they don't just let things go. They'll fight this. And they'll fight dirty. We need more than just the footage. We need witnesses. Corroboration. Something they can't twist. Leona exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling to the surface. It feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. They've already decided I'm the problem. Evan leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. I know it feels that way. But you're not alone in this. The truth is on your side. And the more they push, the more they reveal about themselves. Before Leona could respond, there was a knock at the door. An officer poked his head inside, his expression cautious. Mitchell, you've got someone asking for you at the front desk. Says he has information about the case. Evan's brow furrowed, but he nodded. I'll be right there. He stood, looking at Leona. Wait here. I'll be back. Leona watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. The room felt heavier in his absence, the silence pressing against her like a weight. She leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning with the implications of what Evan had said. Patterns, connections, power. It was always the same, no matter how far she thought she had come. Minutes later, Evan returned, his expression a mix of surprise and urgency. He was followed by an older man in a crisp suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. The man carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the value of his words. Leona, Evan said, his tone softer now. This is Henry Lawson. He was a passenger on the flight. Henry extended his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. Miss Harper, I'm sorry for what you've been through. I believe I have information that might help. Leona blinked, her heart racing. What kind of information? Henry glanced at Evan, then back at her. I saw Sarah Benson on the plane before takeoff. She was near the crew's storage area. And she had the ring in her hand. She tucked it into her pocket before walking down the aisle. Leona's breath caught. You're sure? Absolutely, Henry replied. I didn't think much of it at the time. But after hearing what happened, I realized it might be important. Evan nodded, already taking notes. This is exactly what we need, a credible witness to back up the footage. But even as hope flickered in Leona's chest, a darker thought crept in. What if they try to discredit him? Or me? They've already shown they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Evan's jaw tightened. Let them try. The more they push, the more they show their hand. We're not letting this go. Henry placed a reassuring hand on Leona's shoulder. You're not alone in this fight. Miss Harper, people are paying attention now. For the first time in what felt like days, Leona allowed herself to breathe. The road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time, she felt like she had more than just her word to stand on. She had witnesses, she had evidence, and she had allies who were willing to fight alongside her. As they left the room together, the weight on her chest felt just a little lighter. But Leona knew better than to think the fight was over. Sarah and Brian Benson had built their lives on a foundation of power and privilege. And they wouldn't let it crumble without a battle. The storm was far from over, but Leona Harper was ready to face it. The air in the station felt sharper now. The kind of tension that clung to the walls and seeped into every exchange. Leona Harper stood just outside the conference room, leaning against the cold concrete wall. Her mind raced as snippets of the morning's revelations churned within her. Patterns, connections, witnesses. The pieces were coming together. But with each step closer to the truth, the stakes seemed to grow heavier, the resistance more insidious. Inside, Evan Mitchell was speaking in low tones with Captain Rivera, who had finally taken notice of the case after Henry Lawson's testimony. Rivera, a tall man with sharp eyes and a demeanor that carried authority, nodded occasionally, his expression unreadable. Leona couldn't hear their words, but she could see the tension in Evan's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened with each response. She knew the battle wasn't just hers anymore. Evan was putting himself on the line, too. The door to the conference room opened, and Evan stepped out, his face grim but determined. He motioned for Leona to follow him. Rivera's agreed to escalate this, he said as they walked down the hall. We're filing an official inquiry into Sarah and Brian Benson. They'll be questioned, and we'll push for disciplinary action. Leona nodded, though her stomach churned. Do you think they'll cooperate? Evan snorted softly, his lips curling into a wry smile. No, but that's not the point. The more they fight this, the more they reveal about themselves. We just need to stay ahead of them. As they turned a corner, they nearly collided with Sarah and Brian. The Bensons were walking with their lawyer, a sharp-suited man who exuded confidence. Sarah's face was pale but set in a mask of defiance, while Brian's expression betrayed a simmering anger barely contained beneath his stoic exterior. "Well," Sarah said, her voice dripping with disdain, "if it isn't the hero and his martyr." Evan stopped, his stance calm but unyielding. "Sarah, Brian, I assume you've been briefed about the inquiry?" Brian's eyes narrowed. "This is a waste of everyone's time. You're taking the word of a stranger over officers with spotless records." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Spotless? That's not what the files suggest." Sarah stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Leona. "And you," she said, her voice sharp, "I hope you're enjoying this little performance. Do you think this will make people like you? Do you think this will change anything?" Leona met her glare without flinching. "It's not about making people like me. It's about making them see you for what you really are." The hallway fell silent, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on everyone present. Sarah's mask of composure cracked for a split second, a flicker of something raw and unguarded flashing across her face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold smile. "You'll regret this," she said, her tone low and venomous. Leona didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could see the fear behind Sarah's bravado, the cracks in the facade growing wider with each passing moment. Later that afternoon, Leona sat in Evan's small office as he pored over case files and footage. The room was cluttered but warm, a stark contrast to the sterile interrogation rooms she'd grown accustomed to. Outside the window, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the station parking lot. "Look at this," Evan said suddenly, his tone urgent. He spun his laptop around to face her, showing a still frame from the lounge footage. The image was grainy but clear enough. Sarah Benson standing near the refreshments table, her hand holding a small item, a glint of gold visible even in the poor resolution. Leona leaned closer. "That's her with the ring." Evan nodded. "It matches Henry's statement perfectly. She had it before the flight. There's no way she can spin this." But as they studied the footage, Evan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "It's Rivera," he said, answering the call. "Mitchell here." Leona watched as his face shifted, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. When he hung up, his jaw was tight. "They've filed a counterclaim," he said, his voice low. "Sarah and Brian are accusing you of tampering with evidence. They're claiming you planted the chain in the lounge to throw suspicion off yourself." Leona's stomach dropped. "What? That's ridiculous." "Of course it is," Evan said quickly. "But it's a tactic. They're trying to muddy the waters, make it harder for anyone to see the truth." Leona's hands clenched into fists. "They're playing dirty because they know they're losing." "Exactly," Evan said. "And that's why we can't let up. They're counting on you to get scared and back down." Leona took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not backing down. Not now." Evan smiled faintly. "Good, because we're going to fight this all the way." By evening, the station was quieter, the day's chaos giving way to a tense lull. Leona sat alone in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The room was dimly lit, the hum of the vending machine the only sound. She thought of everything that had led her here, the quiet indignities she'd swallowed her whole life, the battles she'd chosen not to fight because the cost seemed too high. But this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or judged for the way they looked or where they came from. The door opened, and Evan stepped inside, his expression tired but resolute. He held a folder in his hand, which he placed on the table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "More files," he said, "from Sarah's previous cases. The patterns are clearer now, disproportionate accusations, discrepancies in reports, all against people who, let's just say, didn't fit the mold." Leona flipped through the pages, her anger growing with each revelation. "She's been doing this for years," she said, her voice trembling, "and no one stopped her. Until now," Evan said, "because now she's up against someone who won't stay quiet." Leona looked up at him, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "Then let's make sure everyone hears." The storm was gathering, and Leona Harper was ready to face it head-on. The air in the station buzzed with an intensity that felt electric, charged with the weight of the confrontation unfolding. By now, the case had become a vortex, pulling in whispers from every corner of the precinct. Officers who once turned a blind eye to Sarah Benson's methods now exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the narrative they had trusted was cracking wide open. Leona Harper sat in the middle of it all, a quiet defiance radiating from her as the storm swirled around her. She had spent the morning preparing herself for the next wave of attacks, knowing full well that Sarah and Brian Benson wouldn't go down without a fight. They had too much to lose, careers built on unshakable reputations, power rooted in an image of control, and a system that had always shielded them. But the tide was turning. Evan Mitchell burst into the room, a stack of papers clutched in one hand and his phone in the other. His face was flushed, his usual calm demeanor cracked by a mix of urgency and determination. "Leona," he said, his voice tight, "we've got them." She stood, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Evan placed the papers on the table between them, his eyes sharp. "Their counterclaim, it's full of holes. The chain they're trying to tie to you? We've got footage from the lounge showing it was planted after you left. And not just by anyone, Sarah herself." Leona stared at him, her breath catching. "You're sure? I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't." Evan replied. "Rivera's already reviewing it. And there's more." He tapped his phone, pulling up an audio file. "A colleague tipped me off to this. It's a recording of Sarah and Brian talking in their office after your interrogation. Listen." Evan hit play, and the room filled with the clipped, hushed voices of the Bensons. "We just need to stick to the story." Sarah's voice hissed. "If we back down now, we're finished. And if they find out you planted the chain?" Brian's voice was sharper, tinged with frustration. "You think they won't dig deeper?" "They won't," Sarah snapped. "They're too focused on her. No one cares what happens to people like her. It's our word against hers. And you know whose word they'll believe." Leona's hands tightened into fists as the recording ended, her heart pounding in her chest. The anger coursing through her was sharp and white-hot. But beneath it was something heavier, something deeper. It wasn't just Sarah and Brian who believed those words, it was the world they represented. A world where people like her were always guilty until proven innocent. Evan's voice cut through her thoughts. "This is it, Leona. This is what we need to dismantle their defense." She looked up at him, her jaw set. "Then let's use it." The confrontation unfolded later that afternoon, in the precinct's largest conference room. Captain Rivera presided over the meeting, his face a mask of measured authority. To his left sat Sarah and Brian Benson, their lawyer flanking them. Sarah's confidence was brittle now, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as though holding herself together. Brian's expression was colder, but his jaw ticked, betraying his unease. Leona sat across from them, flanked by Evan and Henry Lawson. The room was packed with officers, witnesses, and department heads, all drawn to the spectacle of a power dynamic unraveling in real time. Rivera cleared his throat, the room falling silent. "We're here to address the allegations and counterclaims surrounding this case. Officer Mitchell, you may present your findings." Evan stood, his voice steady as he laid out the evidence. He began with the footage, projecting it onto the screen for everyone to see. The room watched as Sarah's figure appeared on the grainy video, slipping the chain under a seat and then walking away. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the weight of the image undeniable. Sarah's face flushed, her hands tightening in her lap. Evan continued, playing the audio recording next. The room grew even quieter, the words hanging in the air like a guillotine poised to fall. When the recording ended, Rivera turned to Sarah and Brian, his gaze piercing. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Sarah's mask finally cracked. "This is a witch hunt," she spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You're taking the word of a thief and a passenger with no credibility over two officers who have dedicated their lives to this department." Leona's voice cut through the tension, steady and unwavering. "This isn't about dedication. It's about accountability. You didn't accuse me because you thought I stole something. You accused me because you thought no one would believe me when I said I didn't." Sarah's eyes flashed, but she said nothing. The room was on edge, the unspoken truth reverberating through the silence. Rivera leaned forward, his tone colder now. "Officer Benson, the evidence is clear. Your actions were deliberate and unethical. This department will not protect you." Brian, silent until now, finally spoke, his voice low and bitter. "You're making a mistake, Rivera. This isn't just about us. It's about what happens when you let people like her think they can get away with." "Enough," Rivera snapped, his voice sharp. This department has failed before by turning a blind eye. Not this time. He turned to Leona, his tone softening. Miss Harper, on behalf of this department, I apologize for what you've endured. We will ensure justice is served. Leona nodded, though the victory felt bittersweet. The fight had exposed more than Sarah and Brian's corruption, it had laid bare the rot in a system that allowed it to flourish. As the meeting adjourned, Sarah and Brian were escorted from the room, their faces pale with fury and defeat. Leona watched them go, her heart heavy but resolute. The storm had broken, but the work was just beginning. The precinct was quieter now, the flurry of the day's events giving way to a tense calm. Leona Harper sat in the dimly lit break room, her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The silence should have been comforting, a reprieve from the storm, but it only made the weight of everything settle heavier on her chest. The confrontation with Sarah and Brian had been a turning point, but not the end. Leona knew better than to believe in clean victories. The system Sarah had exploited wasn't just about individuals, it was about something larger. Something deeper. It was the unspoken rules that governed who was believed and who wasn't. Who was protected and who was left to fend for themselves. Evan Mitchell entered the room, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. He carried a folder under his arm, his steps purposeful. Leona, he said, pulling up a chair across from her. There's something you need to see. She straightened, setting her cup aside. What is it? Evan placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were records, some printed, some handwritten, and all damning. It's not just Sarah and Brian. He began. There are patterns across multiple cases, accusations without evidence, reports that don't add up, and always the same kinds of victims. Leona frowned, her eyes scanning the documents. People like me, she said quietly. Evan nodded. Low-income passengers, people of color, anyone who didn't fit their idea of belonging. They've been using their positions to target and discredit people for years. Most cases never even made it this far. She closed the folder, her hands trembling slightly. How is this allowed to happen? It's the way the system's built, Evan said, his voice heavy. People like Sarah thrive in it because it protects them. They know the right people, and the right people look the other way. Leona looked at him, her frustration spilling over. And now that the truth is out, what happens? Do they just get quietly pushed out while the system moves on like nothing ever happened? Evan met her gaze, his expression resolute. Not this time. Rivera's backing a full investigation, and the department is under pressure from outside. The community is watching now. Leona exhaled sharply, the tension in her chest loosening slightly. Good, because this isn't just about me. It never was. That evening, the department held a press briefing. The room was packed, reporters jostling for position as the cameras flashed incessantly. At the podium stood Captain Rivera, his presence commanding but somber. To his side was Evan, his stance calm and steady. And next to Evan, for the first time in this entire ordeal, stood Leona. The hum of the crowd quieted as Rivera began to speak. Today, we address not only the actions of two individuals but the broader failures that allowed those actions to go unchecked. Miss Harper's case has brought to light serious issues within our department, issues that demand accountability and reform. He turned to Leona, his tone softening. Miss Harper, I want to thank you for your courage in standing up, not just for yourself but for everyone who has been failed by this system. Leona stepped forward, her heart pounding. The room felt impossibly large. Every eye fixed on her, every camera trained to capture her next words. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This isn't about one ring or one accusation, she began. It's about a system that decides who is believed and who isn't. Who is given the benefit of the doubt and who is assumed guilty. It's about the quiet injustices that happen every day, the ones that go unnoticed because no one wants to see them. Her words hung in the air, the room silent except for the soft clicks of cameras. For too long, people like me have been told to stay quiet, to keep our heads down, and to accept that this is just the way things are. But I'm here to say that it's not. It doesn't have to be. The audience erupted into applause, a sound that felt both overwhelming and affirming. But Leona didn't let herself get swept away. This wasn't the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. After the briefing, Leona and Evan stood outside the precinct, the cool night air wrapping around them like a bomb. The city lights sparkled in the distance, A reminder of the world beyond this small but significant battle. "You did good in there," Evan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Leona shook her head, a small smile of her own breaking through. "We did, but it's not over." "No," Evan agreed, his tone serious. "But it's a start." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling between them. And for the first time, Leona felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. The storm had revealed the cracks in the system, but it had also shown her the strength in standing against it. And as she looked out at the city, she knew she wasn't done yet. The morning came slowly, the city bathed in a pale, gray light. Leona Harper stood at the edge of a small park across from the courthouse, watching as the world around her stirred to life. People bustled along the sidewalks, their faces focused, their steps hurried, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing just out of sight. For Leona, this day was not ordinary. This was the day when the fight shifted from whispered accusations and veiled threats to something public and undeniable. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the folder inside. It held everything: documents, witness statements, and the grainy but damning footage that had brought the truth into focus. Today, she wouldn't just be defending herself, she would be exposing a system that had long thrived in the shadows. "Are you ready?" Evan Mitchell's voice broke through her thoughts. Steady and calm, he stood beside her, his tie slightly askew, his face lined with the fatigue of a battle that felt endless. Leona nodded, though her stomach churned with a mix of anticipation and fear. "As ready as I'll ever be." Evan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're going to fight dirty, but we've got the truth on our side. Don't let them rattle you." She offered him a faint smile, appreciating his confidence even as doubts gnawed at the edges of her resolve. "Let's do this." The courtroom was a different kind of battlefield: polished wood and muted tones. The hum of murmured conversations bouncing off the high ceilings. Sarah and Brian Benson sat at the defense table, their lawyer flanking them like a fortress. Sarah's expression was tight, her composure held together by threads that threatened to snap. Brian, on the other hand, wore a mask of quiet indignation, his eyes betraying a simmering anger that spoke volumes. Leona sat across from them, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear the unspoken judgments that filled the room, but she refused to shrink beneath their scrutiny. This time, she would not be silent. The proceedings began with the usual formalities, the judge's voice firm as he laid out the scope of the hearing. But it wasn't long before the tension in the room began to build, every word spoken cutting deeper into the tangled web of lies and truths. "Miss Harper," the Benson's lawyer began as he approached the stand, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. "You've accused my clients of deliberately framing you. That's a serious allegation. Do you have proof to support such a claim?" Leona met his gaze, her voice steady. "Yes, I do." Evan handed a flash drive to the clerk, who inserted it into the courtroom's display system. The footage played on the screen, the grainy image of Sarah Benson placing the chain under the seat in the lounge. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the evidence hanging heavy in the air. Sarah's lawyer quickly rose to object. "This footage is inconclusive at best." But the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "We'll let the jury decide its value." "Continue, Miss Harper." Leona glanced at Evan, who nodded encouragingly. "This isn't just about the chain," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "It's about a pattern, a history of accusations against people like me, people who don't look like they belong in places like that lounge." Sarah Benson used her position to target and silence us because she knew no one would question her. The room buzzed with murmurs, the weight of her words cutting through the carefully curated facade of the defense. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. But the turning point came when Henry Lawson, the passenger who had witnessed Sarah's actions on the plane, took the stand. "I saw her with the ring," he said plainly, his voice calm but resolute. "She was standing near the crew area before takeoff. She put it in her pocket. It was clear she was trying to hide it." The Benson's lawyer attempted to discredit him, questioning his memory and motives. But Henry remained steadfast, his credibility unshaken. By the afternoon, the courtroom had turned into a pressure cooker. Sarah and Brian's defense grew more desperate, their arguments unraveling under the weight of the evidence. But what struck Leona most was not their indignation, it was the subtle shift in the room. The way the jurors exchanged glances. The way even the Benson supporters seemed to falter under the growing realization that the truth was not on their side. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, Leona stepped outside, the cool air hitting her like a bomb. Evan was at her side, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You were incredible in there," he said. Leona shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about me. It's about everyone who's been through what I have and didn't get this chance." Evan nodded, his respect for her evident. "And you're making sure they're heard." As they walked away from the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and questions flying. Leona paused, taking a deep breath before speaking. "This isn't just about one case," she said, her voice carrying over the chaos. "It's about a system that protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did. And I won't stop fighting until that system changes." The crowd erupted into applause, her words striking a chord that reverberated far beyond the courthouse steps. That night, Leona sat by her window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt a sense of purpose that burned brighter than her fear. She thought of the people who had stood by her, the ones who had believed her when it mattered most. And she thought of the countless others who were still waiting for their voices to be heard. She would not let them wait in silence. The storm was still raging. But Leona Harper was no longer afraid of the dark. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, the kind that filled the spaces between heartbeats and lingered in the corners of whispered conversations. Today was the final day of the hearing, and every seat was occupied. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of curiosity and dread that clung to the walls and weighed down on everyone inside. Leona Harper sat at her table, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent countless nights imagining this moment, not the vindication, but the sheer exhaustion of it. The cost of standing against power was never just the fight itself, it was the accumulation of every glance, every word, every silence that had sought to crush her spirit. Across the room, Sarah and Brian Benson sat with their lawyer. The cracks in their facade were impossible to ignore now. Sarah's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, her once pristine posture slightly slouched. Brian looked more stoic, his jaw clenched, but even he seemed smaller, as though the weight of the evidence had shrunk the space he occupied. The judge entered, and the room stilled. He surveyed the courtroom with the gravity of someone who understood the significance of what was about to unfold. "We will begin with closing statements," the judge announced. "Defense, you may proceed." The Benson's lawyer rose, his polished demeanor still intact despite the mountain of evidence against him. His voice was smooth, calculated, as he wove a narrative of doubt and distraction, painting his clients as victims of a smear campaign. He questioned the reliability of the witnesses, the validity of the footage, and even the intentions of Leona herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the jury, "ask yourselves this. Are we really going to let the word of one person, driven by resentment, dismantle the careers of two respected officers? The evidence is circumstantial. The motivations are suspect. This is not justice, it's retribution." Leona felt her chest tighten, the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, a caricature. She glanced at Evan, who gave her a slight nod, his confidence in her unwavering. "Prosecution," the judge said, "your closing statement." Evan rose, his presence commanding but measured. He didn't pace or gesticulate wildly, he simply spoke, his words cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. "This case is not about a missing ring," he began. "It's about power. It's about who is believed and who is dismissed. It's about the quiet, insidious ways that prejudice operates, not with loud accusations, but with whispers, with assumptions, with the unspoken certainty that someone like Leona Harper could never be innocent." He turned to the jury, his gaze steady. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony. This isn't about retribution. It's about accountability." Sarah and Brian Benson used their positions to target someone they thought no one would believe. But they were wrong. Evan paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "This case is an opportunity to say that we see what happened, that we won't look away, and that we demand better, not just for Leona Harper, but for everyone who has been silenced by the same system." The room was silent as he returned to his seat. The judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. And the waiting began. Hours passed like molasses, each minute stretching longer than the last. Leona sat outside the courtroom, staring at the pale yellow walls that seemed to close in around her. Evan sat beside her, occasionally glancing at his phone but saying little. He knew there were no words that could ease the tension in this moment. Finally, the bailiff appeared. The jury has reached a verdict. Leona's heart pounded as she stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She walked back into the courtroom, every step heavy with the weight of what was to come. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable, their collective silence deafening. The judge took his seat and looked to the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreperson replied. Standing, she held a small slip of paper in her hand, her expression neutral but firm. In the matter of Sarah and Brian Benson, she said, her voice steady, we find the defendants guilty on all counts. The room erupted not in cheers or outrage, but in the collective release of tension that had been building for days. Sarah let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her face as tears spilled over. Brian's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Their lawyer immediately stood, promising an appeal, but the words sounded hollow, their impact dulled by the finality of the verdict. Leona sat back, a wave of emotion crashing over her. Relief, exhaustion, vindication, it all blended together in a storm that left her trembling. She felt Evan's hand on her shoulder, steadying her, grounding her. You did it, he said quietly. No, Leona replied, her voice barely above a whisper. We did. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered: reporters, community members, people who had followed the case with a mix of hope and skepticism. As Leona stepped into the sunlight, a cheer went up, a sound that felt both surreal and overwhelming. She approached the microphone set up on the courthouse steps, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the podium. The crowd fell silent, waiting. This isn't just a victory for me, she began, her voice strong despite the tears threatening to spill. This is a victory for everyone who has been told they don't belong, who has been judged without evidence, who has been silenced because it was easier than confronting the truth. She paused, letting her words sink in. But this is only the beginning. The system that allowed this to happen is still here. And we have to keep fighting, not just for justice, but for change. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices lifting her in a way she hadn't thought possible. As she stepped away from the podium, Evan walked beside her, his expression a mix of pride and exhaustion. So, what now? He asked. Leona looked out at the crowd, at the faces filled with hope and determination. She thought of the battle still ahead, the voices still waiting to be heard. Now, she said, we keep going. And with that, she stepped into the future undaunted, unbowed, and ready to fight. The weeks that followed the verdict were a blur of interviews, meetings, and public appearances. Leona Harper had become a symbol, though the weight of that title was not something she had sought or felt entirely comfortable carrying. Each step forward felt like it came at the cost of a piece of herself. But she knew the fight was no longer just about her. It never had been. The days were full, but the nights were lonelier, heavier. Alone in her apartment, she stared out at the city skyline, its lights blinking like distant stars, each one a reminder of lives she would never know, people who might never see the justice she had fought so hard to claim. For every victory, there were a dozen battles still left unwon. It was during one of these nights, the air thick with the scent of impending rain, that her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway, her voice cautious. Miss Harper? The voice on the other end was measured, polished, a man accustomed to being heard. This is Frederick Monroe. I'm with the Civil Rights Accountability Network. I believe we need to talk. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, far from the press and prying eyes. Monroe was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his suit impeccably tailored. He radiated the kind of authority that came not just from position but from decades of hard-won experience. I followed your case, he said after the initial pleasantries, his hands folded neatly on the table. What you've done is extraordinary. Leona shifted in her seat, uncomfortable with the praise. I just told the truth. Monroe smiled faintly, a knowing look in his eyes. That's not as simple as you make it sound, especially in a world that's built to silence voices like yours. Leona's gaze met his, the weight of his words settling over her. The system isn't just broken, she said, her voice steady but tinged with anger. It was designed this way. Monroe nodded. Exactly. And that's why I'm here. The verdict was a step. But we need to turn it into a movement. With your story, your voice, we can shine a light on the systemic issues that allowed this to happen and that continue to harm countless others. Leona hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. I'm not an activist, she said quietly. I didn't set out to be a symbol. No one does, Monroe replied. But the best movements are led by people who didn't ask for the spotlight but chose to use it anyway. Leona looked away, her mind racing. She thought of the courtroom, the faces of the jurors, the crowd outside. She thought of Sarah Benson, whose defiance had crumbled under the weight of her lies, and of all the unnamed people who had suffered in silence because no one had believed them. Finally, she nodded. What do you need from me? The next few months were a whirlwind. Leona found herself thrust into a world of advocacy and activism, speaking at events, meeting with lawmakers, and lending her voice to campaigns for systemic reform. Each day brought new challenges, new hurdles to overcome, but also new allies, people who had waited for someone to say the things they had been too afraid or too tired to say themselves. But with the newfound platform came backlash. The Benson supporters launched a smear campaign, flooding social media with vitriol, questioning her motives and integrity. Anonymous threats filled her inbox. And more than once, she found herself looking over her shoulder in crowded places. One evening, as she walked home from a community meeting, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The city seemed darker than usual, the streets quieter, the air heavier. She turned a corner and stopped short, her heart racing. A man stood under a flickering street lamp, his face partially obscured by the shadows. For a moment, she froze, fear tightening in her chest. But then he stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Miss Harper, he said, his voice soft but firm. I just wanted to thank you. She blinked, her breath catching. Thank me? The man nodded. You don't know me, but I followed your case. What you did, it gave me hope. People like us, we don't often get that. Leona's shoulders relaxed, the tension easing slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. But it's not over. There's so much left to do. He smiled faintly. That's why we keep going. As he walked away, Leona stood there for a moment, the weight in her chest shifting. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, a quiet resolve that burned brighter than before. By the time the rain began to fall, Leona was back in her apartment, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She sat by the window, watching the droplets race down the glass, her thoughts turning to the road ahead. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. The storm outside mirrored the one within her, but instead of fear, she felt something stronger, determination. The voices of the past and the present echoed in her mind, a chorus of resilience and defiance. Leona Harper had stepped into the light, and she wasn't going back. The auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of chairs filled quickly. The audience a diverse tapestry of faces, students, activists, community leaders, elders who had witnessed lifetimes of struggle. At the center of the stage stood a podium, illuminated by a single spotlight, waiting for its speaker. This moment felt monumental, not just for Leona Harper but for everyone who had followed her journey. Backstage, Leona paced, her hands gripping the edges of her speech. The words she had written were personal yet universal, reflecting the weight of the truths she had uncovered and the hope she still carried. Each step brought a surge of memories: the courtroom, the stares of strangers, the quiet moments when she had doubted herself. But as she looked at Evan Mitchell standing nearby, his supportive smile unwavering, she reminded herself why she was here. You're going to be great, he said, his voice calm but firm. Just speak from your heart. Leona nodded, though her chest tightened with the enormity of what lay ahead. This isn't just about me, she whispered, more to herself than to him. It never was, Evan replied. The stage manager motioned for her to step forward. The audience quieted as she emerged from the shadows, the sound of her heels on the polished wood echoing in the silence. As she reached the podium, she took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the microphone. For a moment, she simply stood there, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw familiar faces: Henry Lawson, Frederick Monroe, Captain Rivera and countless strangers who had come to hear her story. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her. But it also lifted her. She wasn't standing here alone. She began softly, her voice steady but intimate. When I first stepped into that airport lounge, I didn't know how much my life was about to change. I didn't know that I was walking into a storm that would test everything I believed about justice, truth, and resilience. Her words hung in the air, the audience leaning forward as though pulled by an invisible thread. But this isn't just my story, she continued, her voice gaining strength. This is about a system that has been built on silence and complicity. A system that thrives on the quiet suffering of those it deems unworthy. It's about the unspoken rules that decide who gets the benefit of the doubt and who is presumed guilty before they've even spoken. The tension in the room thickened, the gravity of her words sinking in. She glanced at the speech in her hand, but then set it down. She didn't need it. I've spent my life navigating spaces where I wasn't wanted, she said, her voice rising with conviction. Spaces where my presence was questioned, my worth measured by the color of my skin and the assumptions tied to it. And for too long, I stayed quiet. I told myself that if I just worked harder, if I just kept my head down, I could avoid the weight of those judgments. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. But silence is not survival. Silence is surrender. And I refuse to surrender. Applause rippled through the room, a wave of affirmation that bolstered her resolve. When Sarah and Brian Benson accused me, they didn't just see a missing ring. They saw an opportunity to protect themselves at my expense because they believed the world would side with them. They believed that no one would listen to someone like me. And they weren't entirely wrong at first. Her voice softened, but her words cut deeper. Because the truth is, they weren't just counting on their power. They were counting on the power of a system that has always worked in their favor. A system that isn't broken but designed this way. And that's what we're here to confront. She stepped away from the podium, walking to the edge of the stage. The audience seemed to hold its breath. This isn't just about reform, she said. It's about reckoning. It's about tearing down the walls that have kept so many of us out. Walls built on fear and prejudice and the belief that some lives matter less than others. Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed on, her words laced with determination. We have to demand better not just from the systems that govern us, but from ourselves. We have to be brave enough to speak out, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The applause was thunderous this time, a standing ovation that filled the auditorium with energy. Leona stood there, tears in her eyes but her chin held high, the gravity of the moment washing over her. As the applause subsided, she returned to the podium for her final words. This is not the end of the fight. It's the beginning of a movement. And it's a movement that belongs to all of us. Together, we can change this. Together, we can make the world listen. She stepped back as the audience erupted again, the sound a mix of cheers and clapping that echoed long after she left the stage. Later that night, Leona found herself on the Congress Avenue Bridge, the city lights reflecting on the Colorado River below. Evan stood beside her, the quiet between them comfortable but charged with meaning. You were incredible, he said after a while. Leona smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the water. I just hope it was enough. Evan shook his head. It wasn't just enough, it was everything. She turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. Then let's make sure it matters. As they stood there, the wind carrying the distant hum of the city, Leona felt something she hadn't in years, the freedom to dream. To believe that the fight she had endured wasn't just survival, it was the beginning of something transformative. And for the first time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. For everyone who deserved to be heard. The dawn was coming, and this time, it would belong to all of them.